Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. My name is Rosie Merlin, and I'm a librarian here at the Main. Yay, librarians. So I, along with a few other librarians, was lucky enough to receive an advance copy of Season of the Witch earlier this year, and it quickly became one of my favorite books. I've recommended to many librarians and friends who are really passionately interested in San Francisco history, especially when it is this well-written and compulsively readable. It's my pleasure to welcome David Talbot tonight. After his talk, he will be happy to sign your books at the back of the room, where the Friends of the Library has them for sale. Tell you a little bit about David. He is the founder of Salon, and in addition to Season of the Witch, he is the author of the bestselling Brothers, The Hidden History of the Kennedy Years, as well as Devil Dog, the amazing true story of the man who saved America. David Talbot has worked as a senior editor for Mother Jones magazine and has written for numerous publications. He has been hailed as a web pioneer by the New York Times and one of the 50 people who matter most in the new media world by Newsweek. Please join me in welcoming David.
I feel like Pat Sajak coming out from behind the curtain there, which I once did when Pat Sajak had a talk show many years ago. It was a very strange experience. You're hit by the lights and suddenly there's an audience there, but I can see you as opposed to Pat's audience, and it's great to see you tonight. Thank you, Rosie. And it's wonderful to be back in the library. I spent a lot of time here as I was working on my book, researching Season of the Witch. I acknowledge that in the beginning of the book, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with the wonderful sixth-floor history center here, which is an invaluable, thank you, yes, an invaluable source of information about the city that we all live in and love. So I'm going to begin with a few brief prepared remarks, and then I'd like to read you an excerpt from the book, and then open it up to a conversation about our city. I want to begin with a quote, because I think it's very appropriate, that I just happened to read in a book called Stories in the Sand by a local historian about the Sunset District. And in the introduction to the book, there's this wonderful quote by Wendell Berry, who you all know is a terrific writer, poet. And Wendell Berry wrote, "You don't know where you are, you don't know who you are, rather, until you know where you are." And that was one of the things that compelled me to write this book, San Francisco, which is really in the, how many years now? Over 30 years I've lived here, just become part of my very marrow, and I'm sure yours as well. And in many ways, my book is kind of, as I said, a bloody Valentine to this city of ours. Earlier this month, we witnessed the triumph of San Francisco values on a national level. Our first African-American president reelected to the White House, our first openly gay candidate elected to the U.S. Senate, our first the defeat of anti-gay and anti-women candidates and propositions from Florida to Minnesota and, yes, Arizona. The legalization of marijuana in Colorado and Washington, a backlash against the corporate takeover of politics and the victories of Proposition 30 and defeat of Prop 32 in California, and the election, one of my personal favorites, of Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts. Yay. And I think it can be argued that the roots of these developments all started right here in our city by the bay. These so-called San Francisco values, gay marriage, medical marijuana, universal health care, livable minimum wage, immigrant sanctuary, prostitute rights, I could go on, were first unveiled here in San Francisco before they started spreading across the country. Of course, we did roll back the freedom to be butt naked in public, but hey, you can still let it all hang out at parades and street festivals, so we're still not Utah. Throughout the world, San Francisco is regarded as a progressive paradise, but the values that define the city were not born with flowers in their hair, as I write in the book. They were born howling in blood and strife. I wonder how many of the young people cruising along in their Wi-Fi-equipped commuter buses to Silicon Valley, because they prefer, of course, to live in a free and innovative city like San Francisco instead of the suburbs. I wonder how many of them appreciate what it took for the city to become such an attractive oasis. Before San Francisco became famous for outraging Bill O'Reilly and Karl Rove and igniting national culture wars, the city first had to settle its own civil war. San Francisco's own internal war, which began in the mid-1960s and raged into the 1980s, was more violent and traumatic than anything we've seen on the national level. There were savage murder sprees, mysterious bombings, political assassinations, street riots, the largest cult suicide, or more accurately, massacre in history, and a terrifying sexual epidemic. In the process, a new city was born. San Francisco was a city that radically changed itself and then changed the world. From a tough port town dominated by a traditional Irish, Italian, Catholic power structure, San Francisco became the capital of political, cultural, and sexual freedom. Or, as Paul Kantner of the Jefferson Airplane put it, San Francisco is 49 square miles surrounded by reality. I wanted to write a history of San Francisco the way that one of its great writers, Dashiell Hammett, might have told it, with blood and fog and mystery, with tough guys and even tougher dames. I begin my book, Season the Witch, with the tale of lawyer Vincent Hallinan, the legendary two-fisted Irish San Franciscan, yay Vince, who took on City Hall, the cops, the Catholic Church, and finally the federal government in his never-ending battle for truth and justice. Vince and his glamorous wife, Vivian, stepped right out of a Hammett novel. They were sexy, stylish, clever, brave, and adventurous. Like Nick and Nora from the Thin Man books and movies, they were equally at home with mugs and millionaires, racketeers, and radicals. Vince and Viv were the bridge from Hammett's rough and tumble town in the 1920s and 30s to the San Francisco of today, a progressive's dream of Oz. My book is divided into three sections. In part one, I tell the story of the enchantment of San Francisco, how a wave of young outcasts and dreamers came pouring into the city in the 1960s and magically transformed it. I introduce a cast of characters so colorful only San Francisco could have produced them. The Diggers. How many people know of the Diggers? Yes, great. Peter Coyote, Peter Berg, Emmett Grogan. They were politics as street theater. They promoted the idea of free music, free food. And of course, many of their ideas still ripple today in movements like Occupy. The Reverend Edward Beggs and the Huckleberry House, who revolutionized the idea that runaways were a family problem, not a police problem. It was against the law back in the 1960s for young people to hit the road, to run away from families that were exploding around them. And a young minister, Ed Beggs, put his body on the line, literally was arrested for creating a shelter for these kids, and it's still there, Huckleberry House. Dr. David Smith and the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, another great hero of the 1960s up until today. Tom Donahue, the great DJ and the birth of underground radio, KMPX, KSAN, that was our internet. For a young person in the 1960s who wanted to be plugged into the rest of the world, to hear that tom-tom beat from other cities around the country and around the world, you listened to underground FM radio. And really the birth of FM underground radio as we knew it then was here in San Francisco. San Francisco Chronicle. I'm going to read a little excerpt about the San Francisco Chronicle back in the 60s, because those of us who are used to it today would be, I think, shocked at the San Francisco Chronicle of the 1960s. Scott Newhall, its wacky and maverick editor at the time, called the Chronicle in those days the first mainstream underground newspaper, and it was in many ways. The Great Cockettes, sexual radicals, or as they call themselves, chicks with cocks. John Waters, who got his start, the filmmaker, hanging around with the Cockettes, called the troupe complete sexual anarchy, which is always a good thing, he added. Margot St. James and Coyote, call off your old tired ethics, the prostitutes union. Only in San Francisco would the leader of a prostitute rights movement be embraced by the chief of police, who was Charlie Gaine at the time. Then, of course, part two, the terror, as the 60s imploded around the country, but that implosion was felt most keenly here in San Francisco because we've been the capital of that cultural revolution. Altamont, Charlie Manson, Zodiac and Zebra murders, the People's Temple in Jonestown, the battle for the Haight, which was about to be demolished the way that the Fillmore had been until a group of tough hippies, I tell that story in the book, The Good Earth Commune, and others in the Haight stood their ground and said, no, the bulldozers aren't going to wipe out this community this time. The assassinations, of course, of Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Milk, and the AIDS epidemic. And finally, in part three, which is called Deliverance, I look at how the city saved itself and pulled itself through this trauma and became the city that we love today, that it's enshrined these progressive values and no longer is at war with itself. And I attribute this in part to the steady leadership of a woman who I'm politically often in disagreement with, but as mayor, Dianne Feinstein, I think, played a key role in stabilizing the city at a very crucial time. I also, and was criticized for this by some reviewers because they thought sports is trivial somehow in their mind, but I think Bill Walsh's miraculous San Francisco 49ers also played a very important role in healing the city. And in many ways, the team mirrored the elegance and the eccentricity of San Francisco itself. A team made up of a hodgepodge of broken down veterans and rookies and young players like Joe Montana, who had not quite proved themselves yet. Bill Walsh was also socially innovative, not just innovative as a football tactician, but he hired the first openly gay trainer an NFL team has ever had, and still to this day, there's, to my knowledge, no openly gay trainer in the NFL, Lindsey McLean. He hired Dr. Harry Edwards, who you know is a sociologist from UC Berkeley, but Harry was a very controversial figure in the 60s. The FBI was constantly harassing him. He was one of the leaders and instigators of the boycott of African American athletes of the Olympics in 1968 in Mexico City. Bill Walsh was probably the only coach who would have hired someone like Harry. But ultimately, I think the most important factor that proved our mettle as a city was how we handled the AIDS epidemic. When the virus hit the city in the early 1980s, we had just come stumbling through the bitter culture wars of the 70s. The city had been torn apart, culminating, of course, in the explosion of violence right across the plaza here in November 1978, when a former policeman named Dan White crawled through a city hall window and shot our liberal mayor and gay supervisor, only to be widely cheered throughout the city's police department and conservative neighborhoods, and given a shockingly light verdict by a jury of his peers. As AIDS cases began multiplying around the city, there was a rising wave of panic. The science of the disease was still unknown. Nobody was certain how the virus could be spread at the time. People started avoiding restaurants and closed stores, and the Castros stopped hugging their gay friends. San Francisco could easily, at that point, have fallen back into the abyss that it had just crawled out of, scapegoating its gay brothers and allowing fear and loathing to take over the city. But in the end, because of the compassionate and level-headed leadership of Mayor Dianne Feinstein, who was the daughter of a doctor and had been married to a doctor, and the inspiring activism of the gay and lesbian community, as well as the heroism of the doctors and nurses and healthcare workers on the front lines of the epidemic, people who didn't know whether they were being infected themselves at the time and taking home the virus to their children, particularly those at San Francisco General Hospital's AIDS Ward 5B. The city not only survived because of these people, but its compassionate values triumphed. The city finally lived up to its namesake, St. Francis, patron saint of the weak and suffering. And while Republican politicians and preachers on a national level were scorning the sick and dying and calling for their quarantine and even their branding like concentration camp prisoners, and while some communities were dumping their sick AIDS patients on the street, San Francisco showed the world how you defeat an epidemic, not by turning against each other, but by coming together. The message that we sent to the world was we take care of our own, no matter how sick or helpless or untouchable. And that's the true meaning of San Francisco values. Thank you very much. So I could read a short section that'll make you kind of teary, or I could read you a slightly longer one that's kind of more cheerful and zany. What's the vote? All right, cheerful and zany. That was my mood tonight, too. So this is about a period, I call this the Mad Men period in San Francisco. This is the early 60s, mid-60s. San Francisco was starting to see this revolution building in the street, these kids showing up from all over, and yet the old San Francisco is still very much intact. And a lot of people, while I was researching the book, made it clear to me, look, David, don't, make it seem like San Francisco was this benighted city that had to be liberated by all these young, kids coming to the town. San Francisco, of course, always had its own very wild streak, maverick streak, dating back to the gold rush days. And even the San Francisco establishment, there were members of the establishment who were very open to this change. And so I want to read to you about one of them, a very great eccentric and typically eccentric San Franciscan from the old school, Scott Newhall, who was the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle in the 1960s. San Francisco's cultural revolution was not popular in City Hall or the Hall of Justice Fortress at 850 Bryan Street, but it did find some surprising allies downtown inside the clock tower-topped bunker at 5th and Mission that housed the San Francisco Chronicle. The city's reigning daily was owned by a Republican clan that traced its dynasty back to the Gold Rush founders of the paper. Yet readers opened the Chronicle on many mornings to find the newspaper championing the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic or Huckleberry House, supporting the legal rights of North Beach topless clubs, defending hippies' pursuit of happiness, and denouncing President Lyndon Johnson's deepening quagmire in Vietnam. All of this serious business came wrapped in a candy box of gossip, Carney Barker promotion stunts, cheesecake photographs, and eccentric musings that San Francisco readers found irresistible. To browse the Chronicle each morning was to enter the portals of an enchanted city that was more than slightly cracked. Fun was the paper's first order of business, and any stuffed-shirt official who picked on the city's clowns and misfits or otherwise rained on its cockeyed parade was to be shunned and ridiculed. The brilliant showman behind the Chronicle's daily circus was executive editor Scott Newhall. His button-down boss, publisher Charles de Young Terriot, may not have always seen eye to eye with his editorial antics, but the Terriot family could not argue with the financial results. After taking over the Chronicle in 1952, when it was a gray New York Times wannabe, languishing far behind the Hearst Corporation-owned Examiner in the circulation race, Newhall promptly began winning over San Francisco with his reinvigorated product and wild promotion campaigns. He made it his personal mission to defeat the Hearst newspaper empire, which he regarded as, quote, something evil, the Fox News of its day. Preying on the ignorance and fear of, quote, the Catholic lunchbox San Francisco working man with its, quote, yellow peril sensationalism, right-wing demagoguery, and shameless stories about, quote, ghosts clanking their chains in English castles. This was Newhall's characterization of the rival Examiner. Newhall would offer San Francisco something different, a progressive-minded and witty fish wrap that would appeal to the city's cosmopolitan aspirations and libertine tastes. His aim proved true. The Chronicle circulation soared, finally surging past the Examiner in 1960. Scott Newhall's Chronicle was the perfect match between city and newspaper. The Chronicle did not just give voice to San Francisco, it invented the city. Newhall, who was born and raised in San Francisco, never got over his love affair with his hometown, and the paper was giddy with his passion. He thought of San Francisco as, quote, a fairyland, and his newspaper spun what he frankly called fairy tales that added new layers of mythology to the city. Newhall's Chronicle turned San Francisco into a city of fizz and fun. The cool clink of ice in a chrome shaker could always be heard in its pages. There was actor David Niven, spotted in his suite at the Stanford Court Hotel, raising his glass of Cristal to a full moon and murmuring to himself, "The moon's a balloon." There was Bobby Kennedy at a rooftop party in the Haight with the Grateful Dead, doing what the dead did. It was the kind of city where anything could happen. Low-rent glamour girls were reborn as high society hostesses. Square-jawed yachtsmen were inconveniently netted in raids on all-male night spots. When there was no fun to be found, Newhall simply made it up his own. He ran a story about an eccentric millionaire who was campaigning to clothe naked animals, which turned out to be a hoax. He ginned up an international incident when he launched a crusade to liberate Anguilla, a spit of sand in the Lesser Antilles, from the British Empire. The mischievous editor's most famous stunt, an investigative series on the dismal quality of the coffee that was being served in San Francisco establishments, was actually his most legitimate. Newhall could remember when San Francisco was a coffee town and the air was filled with the earthy aroma of roasting beans. When I was a child, he recalled, this was a huge shipping port. The ships came in from all over the world. As a small boy going along the waterfront, you could smell the coffee roasting. Hills Brothers, MJB, Alta Coffee, Folgers Coffee, and oh, it smelled so good, the coffee roasting. You could smell the spices in the old tramp freighters that were tied up along the waterfront, the copra and jute and teakwood logs and all that stuff. But things had gone downhill in San Francisco, and now its citizens were being served watery and rancid brews that were a disgrace to the city's fragrant heritage. So Newhall ordered a young reporter to investigate, quote, what the hell San Franciscans were drinking today. So my reporter went up and down Market Street, he said. He went to the hotels, and oh my God, he found coffee urns with dead rats in them and everything else. Or the coffee was 3 or 4 days old, and the stuff they were selling here was just totally junk. Newhall splashed the series across the front page of the paper under the opening symbol crash of a headline, quote, a great city's people forced to drink swill. Still one of the great headlines. The coffee expose became infamous in journalism circles, forever branding the Chronicle as a frivolous waste of newsprint. Berkeley media professors took to fulminating about Newhall's antics. Meanwhile, the sad sack Examiner, now consigned to a distant second in the circulation race, scurried around trying to expose the Chronicle's exclusives as fakes, which of course they often were. Scott Newhall could be gravely serious, though, when he had to, but he clearly preferred to live his life in an amusement park of his own making, and much of San Francisco wanted to join him there. This guy was a complete wacko, remarked William German, who succeeded Newhall as editor of the Chronicle, but a very talented wacko, and probably right for the time. Newhall's escapades seemed to be his bulwark against life's inevitable veil of sorrows. By the time he made it to the top of San Francisco's newspaper racket, the miseries had piled up around him. Newhall was born into a pioneer ranching family that had multiplied its wealth in real estate and finance. He knocked around various California prep schools, but didn't manage to graduate from any of them. He got himself into UC Berkeley, but again found it more amusing to drink and play than study. In search of adventure, he sailed out the Golden Gate with a friend on a 42-foot ketch called the Mermaid. They had 14 cents between them. But Newhall was a budding photographer, and he planned to underwrite the trip by selling freelance shots to the Chronicle, where he'd been employed briefly. While tramping through Mexico, he was kicked by a horse. In fairness, he kicked it first. And he developed a bone infection in his leg. The rot went so deep that he nearly died, and he had to have the leg amputated when he returned to San Francisco. Oh well, Newhall thought to himself, he didn't want to be a photographer anyway. The Chronicle took pity on him and gave him a job in the newspaper morgue, filing news clippings. It proved to be a resurrection of sorts. Hobbling around on crutches and filing stories about the city and the world he lived in gave Newhall the education he lacked. And deconstructing the newspaper each day with his pair of scissors taught him something about how to put one together. From there, during the early 1940s, he began his relentless climb up the Chronicle's editorial masthead. Newhall's ascent at the newspaper was interrupted only by a stint as a war correspondent with the Royal Navy. He found it harrowing on board the motorboat flotillas in the English Channel, running the gauntlet of Nazi submarines, and it made him question his own courage. When he took over the Chronicle in 1952, Newhall surrounded himself with other young men from his generation. After the Depression and the war, newspapering seemed like a game. He was a ruggedly handsome, blue-eyed man, and stalking the newsroom on his artificial leg, he had the swagger of a peg-leg pirate. Even after he got married and had 4 children, 3 boys, including a pair of twins and a girl, Newhall still treated life like a party. His wife, Ruth, whom he had met at Berkeley, was a game sort with her own newspaper career. And the two of them would throw big parties at their ranchito in the Berkeley Hills with a dazzling view of the bay. Newhall loved jazz music and musicians, and his friend Earl Faba Hines would often show up to play piano. Sometimes the parties lasted for days. John Newhall, one of the twins, woke up his parents one morning with this sober report: "The dean is asleep under the oleander." One evening in 1955, during the Christmas season, Newhall's 12-year-old daughter was caroling with some friends in the neighborhood. Suddenly, a tow truck, its brakes having snapped, came roaring down the hill, crushing the girl against a house and instantly killing her. "It was the worst day of our lives," recalled John Newhall many years later. Ruth was devastated. Scott kept pushing forward. Sometime after that, he survived a heart attack. He and Ruth stopped going out much after that. Readers of Scott Newhall's Chronicle were not protected from the world's daily onslaught of mayhem and grief. It was all there in easy-to-read packages with bold-faced leads, surrounded by lots of white space. But embedded in the paper each morning was an absurdist sensibility that said, "You'd better find a way to laugh at life because it will certainly make you cry." Newhall was a registered Republican, but it didn't mean much to him. He hated politics, and he thought religion was for pious hypocrites. He liked cutting against the grain. He called the Chronicle the country's only mainstream underground newspaper. It was the first major daily to come out against the Vietnam War. Grand newspapers like the New York Times and Washington Post liked to snicker at the Chronicle's lack of gravitas. But at least his paper got it right on the big issues. Year after year, the Times and Post kept towing the government lines on Vietnam, Newhall pointed out. They were braying about communists or the domino theory and all this crap. The gullibility of the journalistic establishment never ceased to amaze Newhall. Like all lifelong San Franciscans, Newhall was deeply protective of his town. There was nothing about the hippie invasion of his beloved city that he found particularly endearing. He was strictly a jazz and martini kind of guy. But he knew that he didn't like to see the kids given shabby treatment. San Francisco was supposed to welcome, quote, free souls and kooks, he thought, and so, as much to stick a finger in the eye of the civic establishment as anything else, Newhall made sure that the Chronicle rolled out the welcome mat for the young pioneers flocking into the city. The paper adopted an affectionate, even solicitous tone toward the hippies. Editorially, he said, "I've always felt that everyone should be free to express himself without any particular restraint as long as he doesn't bother the neighbors," the newspaper editor remarked. Or, as they say, you can do it in the streets as long as you don't frighten the horses. That old expression was as succinct an expression of San Francisco's gold rush philosophy as you could find. Just don't frighten the horses. The Chronicle was the city's water well, as Newhall put it, where everyone in town converged. By setting a tone of tolerance toward the hippies, the newspaper played a critical role in shaping the broader community's views. If long-haired boys and girls dancing beneath the diamond sky with one hand waving free was the kind of spectacle that ruined your day, the Chronicle told its readers, well, maybe you weren't a true San Franciscan. Curmudgeons, blowhards, and bullies were regularly treated to a good, swift kick in the pants in Newhall's paper. It was Ralph J. Gleason, yay, the Chronicle's legendary jazz and pop music critic, who brought the newspaper into the rock and roll age. Newhall and Gleason were kindred souls. They roamed the streets of San Francisco together in the 1950s and 60s, sampling the sweet sounds of the night. Gleason introduced his boss to jazz pals like Duke Ellington and Miles Davis. The music critic was a diabetic, and Newhall was trying to lay off the elixir, so they would drink tumblers of branch water on the rocks. As the youth wave came rolling in during the 60s, Gleason immediately recognized that something shimmering was happening in the city. The music columnist was pushing 50 when the revolution hit, but he had the spirit of a man who kept bathing his soul in the fountain of youth, said one friend. Gleason was there in 1965 when the Jefferson Airplane made its debut at a small club in the Marina District called the Matrix. And later that year when the Family Dog Collective held its historic dance concert at Longshoremen's Hall, where he met a young fan of his column named Jan Wenner. Gleason used his daily column as a platform to champion the kids' right to dance in Golden Gate Park. And he talked Newhall and the Chronicle editorial board into siding with Bill Graham against the cops. He never indulged in drugs, but he cultivated his own unique personality with his Sherlock Holmes hat, tweed coat, pipe, and handlebar mustache. He was the patron saint of San Francisco's emerging rock scene. There would have been no Jefferson Airplane without Ralph Gleason, said singer Marty Ballin. There would have been no San Francisco Sound at all, added the airplane's manager, former Chronicle copy boy, Bill Thompson. He was the grown-up who got it, said Wenner, whom Gleason affectionately called Yano. The ambitious Wenner and his mentor would later co-found Rolling Stone magazine. The Chronicle of the 1960s, witty, offbeat, bemused, was a Scott Newhall production, but Newhall preferred to stay behind the curtain, relying on his colorful menagerie of columnists to vocalize the Chronicle point of view. If he was the impresario, the columnists were his players, and he cast them as carefully as a Broadway producer. Trawling for a sports columnist, he found rewrite man Charles McCabe, who didn't like sports. Exactly what Newhall was looking for. Billed as the fearless spectator, McCabe would become a Chronicle institution. He was pictured above his column in a bowler hat, like a member of the London Stock Exchange. But he churned out his copy each afternoon from his perch at jovial Gino and Carlos Saloon in North Beach. McCabe's column offered up an eccentric goulash of opinions, sometimes royalist, sometimes radical, on public affairs, the human heart, or any other damn thing that crossed his mind between scotch and sodas at the bar. For the women's page, Newhall hired a former hairdresser named Mark Spinelli, rechristening him Count Marco. Who remembers Count Marco? A bitch queen columnist who scolded women for being too fat and whiny and instructed them how to emerge from a bathtub without, quote, looking like a cow. It was weird, even Newhall had to admit. Female readers were outraged, but they couldn't seem to get enough of the Count's acid-tongue Betty Davis routine. Newhall's biggest star, by far, was three-dot columnist Herb Caen. His typewriter is above us here in the library, or at least one of them. San Francisco's beloved deadline bard. Every day but Saturday for more than a half century, Caen spun a yarn about San Francisco and its peculiar denizens that was so enchanting the city still remains in its thrall years after his death. He called the town Baghdad by the Bay in his column, conjuring the exotic wonders of ancient Babylon. But his San Francisco was more like Oz, Wonderland, and Gotham City all rolled together. If much of it was Cain's own creation, it's the city that San Franciscans wanted to live in. The columnist concocted a fizzy drink of a city full of witty and beautiful people and amusing scoundrels. It was a shining metropolis with enlightened values and wide-open sensibilities, where Chinese waiters and black cable car bell ringers were as fascinating as Nob Hill playboys. Most of his columns were birdcage ephemera, Pacific Heights marriages on the rocks, celebrity sightings, and punchlines too good to be true, like the 1962 item about San Francisco's most famous madam. Quote, Sally Stanford is off tomorrow for a month in Europe. Have you ever been abroad, she was asked? Always, she replied tartly. But in between the bold names and the patter, there was an epic poem about San Francisco. John Steinbeck got it. Herb City, said Steinbeck, is the one that will be remembered forever, he said. Thank you. So, questions? Yes, start in the front.
One thing that really bothers me right now is how San Francisco is shifting to the right. There's tenant eviction, there's development that's springing up like crazy, they're building dinky apartments, and the thing is that public transportation doesn't run very well. The thing is, there's an attack on the labor movement. And basically, the artists are being driven out of the city. So I don't know. In some ways, I feel this would be a paradise for Scott Walker.
Yeah. Well, my book ends in 1982, and so I conveniently closed the curtain at that point. But look, I mean, I also just wrote a story, a cover story. I don't know if you saw it in San Francisco Magazine a month ago, about how the new dot-com explosion is fucking up the city. And I say that as someone who benefited from the first dot-com explosion here with my publication salon. So I'm not down on all technological, progress and all of that, and the prosperity and opportunity it brings. But I think the city is really wrestling with its soul in some way right now. I agree with you. I'm raising kids here and know a lot of people, young people and older people, who are struggling to hang on here. It's getting increasingly less affordable for them. I confronted Mayor Lee about this, and he understands the problem. He created this housing fund to help middle-income and low-income families find housing. It's too little, obviously. It's the problem is much bigger. And, Mayor Lee tends to be a little bit dazzled by the new tech elite. And I think it's up to us to remind him of what his roots were, which I write about in this book. Ed Lee was once a housing radical. That's how he got his start as a young crusading lawyer, fighting speculators and big real estate landlords in Chinatown. So he understands that San Francisco is a work in progress. And more importantly, we have to understand that. That's the theme of this book, that San Francisco didn't get this way through us just sort of like, enjoying ourselves here and going out to nice restaurants. People fought and died for this San Francisco, the progressive San Francisco that we built. And, that if anyone gets one idea out of this book, that's what I want them to get. And so, look, we're faced with other challenges now, and we have to keep fighting for this city. It's up to us. Yes?
Yeah. What was the most surprising thing you found in your research?
A couple things. Well, one I alluded to earlier, Calvin Welch, who the great longtime Haight-Ashbury activist, turned me on to this group called the Good Earth Commune. And how many, some of you have read the book, but how many who haven't read my book had heard about them before? So they were this amazing commune in the late 60s, early 70s in the Haight. They were tough hippies. They were ex-cons, the two leaders of the group. Many of them were Vietnam veterans. They were tough street runaways, men and women, all races. And they came together and they took over houses in the Haight that were often abandoned. So the Haight, by the late 60s, as those of you who are here then remember, was really starting to fall apart. And the fear about people who loved the Haight was that it was going to become another Fillmore, that Mayor Alioto would use its, the high crime and the drugs that were flooding the neighborhood as an excuse to come in and demolish it and put up high rises and condos and the whole thing. But these tough hippies, with the help of lawyers like Tony Serra, who's another great San Francisco hero, still around, still alive and kicking, they fought City Hall, literally. They fought the cops. They were armed and with guns. They pushed out heroin dealers from their neighborhood. David Smith, the great founder of the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, said, as far as he knows, it's the only time that a neighborhood in those years was taken back physically, violently in some cases, from heroin dealers once they'd gotten their lock on the Haight. So it's an amazing story, and I hadn't heard about this group at all. I found them because they have, God bless the internet, there's they have a community online where they the ones who are still living get together and talk, and so I found them and was able to interview a number of them. And I think it's a great story. One other story, Charles Sullivan. How many people know that name? Before Bill Graham, there was Charles Sullivan. He was the most successful African-American music entrepreneur on the West Coast, going back to Billie Holiday and Duke Ellington, and then up through Ray Charles and Motown acts and James Brown. And he ran the Fillmore before Bill Graham. Mostly black acts, but he was starting to expand. And he was up and down the coast. Very successul guy. He pissed off the cops who were angry because he would sublease the Fillmore to a young Bill Graham who was just starting off in the city as the rock promoter that he became. And Bill Graham says that he couldn't have started without Charles Sullivan. The cops didn't want Bill Graham to be given the Fillmore on dark nights because they didn't want white kids coming into the Fillmore. They thought it would create policing issues for them. But they fought back, Sullivan and Graham, and they were allowed to keep doing it. So Sullivan is murdered on one night in August 1966 in the alley, Bluxom, Bluxom off of 4th, which was a very deserted, funky area at that time before the ballpark and all that. The cops who were on the scene tried to say it was a suicide at first. The coroner said no way, it was a murder. A young Dianne Feinstein, who was kind of a civic do-gooder at the time, got very interested in the case and was putting pressure on the cops to solve it. The crime has never been solved. Some people tie it into Belva Davis, the great reporter, was a young reporter with the African-American newspaper in town. She thought his murder was tied to the redevelopment of the Fillmore because he was opposing that. So it's one of these great sort of Walter Mosley, mysteries, basically. How the leading black businessman in San Francisco could be shot, in an alleyway at night, and that murder never solved. So I interviewed his family and looked through some of the records, and I tell that story as well. So that was another interesting story to me. Back here, and the gentleman.
You interviewed quite a range of people. Okay, you interviewed a wide range of people. I was wondering who refused to be interviewed, and if Joe Freitas in particular was one of them.
Well, Joe Freitas was no longer around by the time I was interviewing people. That would have been a coup if I'd gotten him. But he, let's see, Feinstein was a little difficult. She actually got up during the middle of the interview and tried to walk out on me, and I had to talk her back down. She's a little thin-skinned. Willie Brown, very, artful and evasive, very smooth. I haven't heard from Willie, and he hasn't written about the book. I don't think he's pleased, because one of the things I do, of course, is I write about how the liberal establishment in this town, including, unfortunately, George Moscone and Harvey Milk, were taken in by Jim Jones, and how they were compromised by Jim Jones, because Jim Jones delivered the troops and the votes for them in a very close election for Mayor Moscone, his first election in '75. So that was a stain on the liberal political establishment in this town. And Willie Brown, as far as I know, has really never taken full responsibility for that. In fact, his initial response after the horrendous news starts coming back from Guyana at the time was, I'm not going to shed any tears about this. And, Jim Jones was driven to it, and, really kind of some outrageous stuff. Yes, right here.
Yes, sir. It seems to me that one of the overarching themes of your book is that San Francisco is a city capable of constantly reinventing itself. Mm-hmm. Not perhaps just during the 20-year period or so you're dealing with, but before that and since then. And I'd like you to comment about why you think that is. What is it? Because there are some cities that are capable of doing that. This is not the only one. There are others in this country and around the world. And then there are some other cities that seem mired in sameness and an inability to reinvent themselves. So I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about why you think that's true of San Francisco. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it's because the constant influx of new people. And that's, again, what the book really goes into, is how the city resisted that in some ways, these waves of people, the young, the hippies, of course, and then gays, and immigrant Chinese, and so on. And so the city did not, it was not smooth, that integration of the new into the city. There was definitely conflict there, and bloody conflict in some cases. But ultimately, San Francisco, I think, realized that these people were breathing new life into the city and learned to love them. And they remade the city. So really, this period that I'm writing about, it's phenomenal when you think about it. I can't think of another American city, or maybe any city in the world, that did reinvent itself within such a short period of time. And not just once, but twice and three times, with these different waves of people coming over. And really demographically remaking the city, and politically remaking it, and culturally. It is a phenomenal story that way. And then, of course, becoming the symbol that has an impact on the rest of the country. and the world even. So, it's to me, if this were New York, there would have been 20 of these books written, this in 1 year. But because, the New York media still doesn't quite get it about how important, little San Francisco is, and about the West Coast in general, unless it's Hollywood and LA. That story was overlooked. That's one reason as a journalist I was dying to write it.
Could I just ask
Yeah.
one more thing about that? Do you think that this city is still in a position, and this goes back to the gentleman's first question, do you think it's still in a position to be able to reinvent itself with the kind of vigor it has?
Well, again, that is the big challenge now economically, right? If the young dreamers, the young artists can't afford to live here, my son, who's a musician, he's 22, he's thinking of moving. He's living with me, and he wants to move to Oakland. I mean, because he thinks Oakland actually has more kind of vitality that way now. So, look, it happened in New York. It's Brooklyn now where most of the sort of creativity is. It's not Manhattan. It would be a shame, I think, if San Francisco went that route. And again, though, I don't think the battle's totally lost. One of my heroes is a guy named Buck Baggett. He's a neighbor of mine. I live in Bernal Heights, and Buck one of the founders of Occupy Bernal. They, unlike some of the Occupy groups that went sort of splintered and disappeared, these were people who were longtime organizers. They were really smart. They came out of the labor movement, some of them, the housing movement. They knew what they were doing. They have access to City Hall, and they've saved many, many houses. They've saved, I think, over 100 people from being, thrown out of their houses. They put pressure on Wells Fargo. They put pressure on the banks. So that's what I mean about fighting. To preserve the city, we can't just complain about it. You have to do something about it. And I'm not just lecturing, it's me too. I mean, I wrote this article, but I mean, I've told Buck I want to sign up, I don't want my neighborhood to become just totally yuppified, So anyway, yes, the gentleman way back, and then the man with the baseball cap after that.
Recently that San Francisco is one of the top cities in the country as far as dirty streets. And I moved here in 1991 when we had the mayor then was, I forget his name.
In what year?
1991.
No, yeah, Agnos, I guess.
Yeah, and the city was really continued to evolve into a cleaner and more beautiful place. And then under the mayoral helm of Will Brown Jr., the city sparkled, and the sidewalks and streets seemed cleaner, and the Embarcadero, Fisherman's Wharf, everything seemed cleaner. And now, it's since Gavin Newsom took over, when he became mayor, it seemed like all the city began to decay, and now everywhere you look, and it's not only the Tenderloin, but even in Pacific Heights, which is where I first moved to when I came here, it's sad to see the city going into such disrepair.
Yeah, I know, and it's the issue of homelessness and clean streets is sort of keeps bedeviling the city, and it doesn't matter what it seems who's in power at City Hall or what their political background is. I mean, Gavin came in with great enthusiasm about fixing the homeless problem. And not just sweeping it under the rug the way that Giuliani did in New York. I mean, I think it's to San Francisco's credit that we didn't take the Giuliani approach and just sort of dumped people somewhere else and pushed our problem into other communities or suburbs. San Francisco, because of its progressive heritage, tends to try and, I think, come up with more fundamental solutions. But in doing that, the problems seem to still glare us in the face while we're trying to fix them. I think most people have tended to develop a sort of a sense of patience about that, though, because, in some ways these are very deep and tractable problems. Yes?
To me, the biggest surprise in the book, and you just sort of alluded to it, was the George Moscone election.
Yes.
And you come very close to saying he stole that election, working
Yes.
with Jim Jones. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I think he did steal it. Jim Jones Jr., who was, kind of a rising lieutenant. He was the adopted African-American son of his father and sort of the favored son. I interviewed him. He's a very charming, forthright guy, middle-aged guy now, lives in the city. And he said, yeah, we packed up all our buses. We went from precinct to precinct. We voted once, twice, off, as much as we could. And I think the actual, he won by such a slim margin, Moscone, I think, 4,000 votes, that they could have numerically done that. Now, we'll never know, and the reason we didn't know was he also helped elect Joe Freitas, who was the district attorney. Jim Jones did the same thing for him. And Freitas, I think, was also corrupted by the People's Temple. And he actually hired Jim Jones's lawyer to be his right-hand guy. And so when the feds and the state later went looking for the voting records from 1975 after Jonestown, they had all been, destroyed. So there was a lot of corruption inside City Hall related to Jim Jones, unfortunately. And look, to me, George Moscone, despite everything, is still a hero because he moved the city forward. He gave his life for that. He brought new life and new blood into the City Hall, which had been an old boys, Irish, Italian network. He brought in women and gays and minorities. And, the old guard hated him for it. That's why, when Dan White did his thing, the cops were playing the Notre Dame fight song on the police radio. Even up to, before the assassination, they were writing on the bathroom walls and police stations, who's going to get him, who's going to kill him. So, there was violent tensions that this change provoked. George Moscone was a hero for fighting for that change, and yet I think he did make a pact with the devil, with Jim Jones. And that will always scar his legacy, I think, as it should Harvey Milk. I found a document that Harvey wrote as supervisor to Joe Califano, who was head of HEW under Jimmy Carter, president. And by now, we knew about Jim Jones and what he was up to. He'd taken his flock. He'd gone off to the jungle. There'd been the exposés in New West magazine and all of that. So it wasn't like Harvey didn't know. And Harvey knew even before the rest of us knew, too, because he knew Jones. In any case, even at that late date, Jones was complaining to Milk because they had cut off the Social Security checks to the elderly people in Jonestown, which was a source, of course, for Jones's funding. He stole their checks. And Washington knew about this, and so they finally cut off the checks. And Harvey Milk writes a pleading letter to Califano that really is nauseating to read. He calls the Jonestown community an idyllic, I'm quoting this, an idyllic retirement community. So, again, I'm a progressive. Harvey Milk was a hero to me as well. But you have to acknowledge the mistakes and profound mistakes that some of these politicians made. Yes, the gentleman in the cap.
Do you know the origin of the song Stanton Street? Do you know anything about that?
Stanton Street and Other Sorrows? You mean Rod McEwen? Oh, well, hey, Rod, talk about, that was sort of the Scott Newhall era, right? Early 60s, late 50s. I love that era of San Francisco, kind of the beat period, the hipster period, the nightclubs in North Beach. Rod McEwen's, his poetry's so bad that it's good, Stanton Street and Other Sorrows, right? Listen to the warm. So did you have anything to add about Rod? I hear he moved to L.A., unfortunately, right? I don't know if he's still living. Does anyone know? No, okay. No, there were a lot of great characters like that, kind of kitschy but fun San Francisco characters. The painters, too, the Keens. Remember with the kids with the big eyes? I remember as a kid going up and down Market Street and looking at their gallery, and, it was so bad, but it was very popular. Yeah, one more? Okay, back here.
You have a chapter in the book that discusses Ed Lee, Rose Pack, and Willie Brown as housing activists and progressives in the 70s. And now they're what are called moderates and pro-development. Is there a story behind that, or is it just getting older and richer?
Yes, that's you put your finger on it. It happens to the best of them. But if we had a really good newspaper, they should be explaining those sort of behind-the-scenes things, how power really works in this city, what happened to Rose Pack, what's the real story about Willie Brown, all that kind of stuff. We have a really weak newspaper right now, and that's one reason I wanted to write this chapter that I read to you about Scott Newhall, because as lightweight as the Chronicle was in those days and entertaining, you still had some real journalism, and the columnists often got to the bottom of things because they were hanging out and they would tell you what was really going on. I can't get a sense of the city from reading the Chronicle, and I'm a newspaper junkie, I'm a journalist. I love newspapers, and I don't know if you feel differently, but that's what a newspaper has to do for a city. Like Scott Newhall said, it should be the water well where we all come together every day and you say, this is what's going on. Here are the players. Here's how this issue is breaking down. This is why, this vote went this way at City Hall. Now, there's Mateer and Ross and all that, but it's really small bore journalism to me. No one really puts it together. There's a new editor at San Francisco Magazine. He commissioned me to write this story about, San Francisco going to the dogs now because of the new tech wealth. That was a smart thing to do. The Chronicle should have run that piece months or years ago. He comes from New York. His name's John Steinberg. He has a new issue, which you should also check out. Rose Pack is on the cover. He has a young journalist named Chris Smith who's doing, I think, some good local reporting. I get the whole internet thing. I've started Salon and all that. The blog, there's good local blogs. But you really need a big metropolitan newspaper with the resources of a metropolitan newspaper like the old days to, I think, really tell you what's going on in a city. And the Chronicle has the resources, but I think it's badly edited, and it's kind of just, it's really limp, I think. One more? Okay. Yes?
Would you like to comment on Mercurini's coverage?
Yeah, look, here's what I hear about Mercurini. He's an asshole. That's what I've heard. But you don't, undo an election because a guy's an asshole. I know a woman he lived with who was a New York Times reporter. She's been very open about this. They lived together for 8 years. She said it never touched never touched her, that, he was never violent, in arguments, never got to a threatening level at all. His wife, basically, I think this was a story that was between him and his wife. And the Chronicle, for some reason, that's the other thing about the Chronicle, they go off on these weird crusades like that, or against Occupy. What would Scott Newhall have done with the Occupy movement, the encampment at the Ferry Building, The Chronicle, on certain days, they had 2 columnists and an editorial writing about, the Occupy's got to go. When's Ed Lee going to man up and get rid of them? They played, I think, a really noxious role there. And so, I'm sorry, I went off there a little bit. Yeah, but Mercurini. So I think, look, there's a backstory there. The law and order, people in this town hate him. He's too liberal for them. They wanted to get rid of him. This was a convenient way to do it. And the Chronicle was part of that lynch mob. And I think that's weird for a newspaper to play that role. Yeah. On that note, thank you very much for coming.